Today I'll be talking about employment and income statistics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. At the last census, 2021, Australia was 3.3% Indigenous. If we look at the income levels of non-Indigenous Australians, the typical household has an income of, or had an income of $1,746 per week, and that compares to an average or median Indigenous household having a weekly income of $1,507 per week. The difference is about 15% lower for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households. But the difference doesn't end there. If you look carefully, you'll see that the average household size in Indigenous Australian households is 3.1 versus 2.5 for Australian households as a whole. So there are larger households that are making less money. Now, that increased household size is partly due to a larger number of children, but mostly it's due to the fact that there tend to be more adults per household in Indigenous households, with the result that the standard of living in Indigenous households is actually substantially lower than in non-Indigenous households. We'll see a little later how the personal income statistics for individual Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples the gap is much greater than for household income because Indigenous households often have more than one adult working. Now, another thing to look for here is the median age. You'll see that the median age in Australia is 38 years old. But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, the median age is just 24. That's a massive difference. Now, that difference persists despite the fact that this 38 is driven downward by temporary migration in Australia. Even during COVID in 2021, when the census was taken, there were a large number of temporary, mostly international student migrants in Australia. They drive down the age of the country as a whole. So if you were to look only at Australian citizens for whom we don't have readily available data, we would see an even bigger gap between Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia. That same 15% income gap is visible in Sydney. It's not just a matter of Indigenous people disproportionately living in regional and remote areas. So if I look at the weekly median household income for Sydney as a whole, that's a little over $2,000, almost $2,100. And if I compare it to Indigenous people living in Greater Sydney, it's only $1,779. And again, that's roughly 15% disadvantage for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in Greater Sydney. Once again, that lower income is spread over more people. The household size is larger. And again, we see this age gap between majority Australia and Indigenous Australia being very young. Now, in some very remote areas, the income gap can be truly enormous. Let's look at the median household income in very remote Northern Territory. It's only $1,100, and that's for a much larger household of an average of 4.8 people. Now, that's not true everywhere. In Western Australia, there is some substantial mining wealth in very remote areas, with the result that median household incomes in very remote areas of Western Australia track reasonably well with the national average, and it allows people to live in households that more closely mirror that of the Australian population as a whole, with people in very remote Western Australia living in households an average of 2.7 people, which is very similar to the Greater Sydney typical household for people as a whole that is not focusing just on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we can see that in some cases where there are sources of wealth in remote areas, it's possible to see Indigenous statistics that are similar to non-Indigenous statistics, but where there's not that wealth, for example, in the Northern Territory, we see this massive disparity. Now, the reason for this is pretty clear. Indigenous employment and education levels are relatively low. If we look at all of Australia, the percent of people in the labor force is 61.1%. That's substantially higher than the percent of Indigenous Australians who are in the labor force. Among those in the labor force, 87% of Australians are working, but in the Indigenous labor force, that's again substantially lower. Many people are unemployed, leading to a total percentage of adults who are in employment either full-time or part-time. For all of Australia, that's 53.2%. For Indigenous Australia, that's 42.5%. Again, a substantial gap. Now, part of that gap's due to ages. These data are for Australians aged 15 and older. Of course, most people aged 15, 16, 17, 18 are not in the labor force. And we have seen that Indigenous Australians skew young, meaning that there are a lot of people who are not in the labor force, simply a lot of Indigenous people who are not in the labor force simply because they are young. But you can see the difference among people who are in the labor force. We still see a tremendous gap. Among people in the labor force, all Australia, 87% are working. Indigenous Australia, 78% are working. If you compare education levels, just as a rough cut, in all Australia, 26.3% have a university degree compared to 7.4% for Indigenous Australia. Now, again, the numbers aren't exactly what they seem. These are 15 plus figures. And the reason for that 15 plus is that these data collection standards were set just after the Second World War, at a time when many people left school and entered the labor market at 15 or 16 years old. That's not the case anymore, but the statistics still reflect that historical fact, that historical practice, with the result that, among Australians who are over age 25, more like 40% today, between the ages of 25 and 35, have university educations. But this, again, is just a benchmark for the population as a whole. For all Australia, 26% with university degrees. Indigenous Australia, 7% with university degrees. The week median personal income, now we're not talking households here where there may be multiple people working in the same household. The median personal income in all Australia is a little over $800, while the median personal weekly income for Indigenous Australians is $540. The gap is approximately 1/3. That is, Indigenous Australian individuals are earning 33% less than non-Indigenous Australians. Now, there are three main components that contribute to that income gap. First, Indigenous Australians are simply younger than the population as a whole, and young people tend to have lower incomes. Income follows a life course pattern. People tend to have lower income when they're younger, reach maximum income between the ages of 45 and 55, and then start to have declining income after age 55. So the fact that Indigenous Australians are younger than the population as a whole would naturally lead them to have lower median incomes. Second is we've seen Indigenous Australians tend to be less likely to be employed and are much less educated than non-Indigenous Australians. And of course, employment is the route to income. If you're living on government benefits, you're likely to have much lower income than somebody who is employed. Who's likely to be employed? Well, people who have more education. So these are direct contributors to the income gap. And finally, Indigenous Australians disproportionately live in remote and very remote areas where job opportunities are scarce. It's not a large proportion of the Indigenous population, like I said, about 15%, but it's a much larger proportion of the Indigenous population than it is of the population of Australia as a whole. Okay, first let's look at age. The median age of Indigenous Australians is just 24. Why is it so young? Well, first, Indigenous Australian women have a somewhat higher fertility rate. The fertility rate for the Australian population as a whole is 1.48. Now you'll see I've put a asterisk next to that, and that's because it's not really 1.48. That number includes the fertility of temporary migrants, so international students and working holiday makers. International students and working holiday makers rarely have children. The actual fertility rate for Australian women is probably closer. It's around 1.7. I don't have an exact number, but it's around 1.7. The Indigenous Australian fertility rate is 2.13. Now, that may sound a lot higher than 1.7. Actually, that's an appropriate fertility rate. Ironically, it's Indigenous Australians who have a level of fertility that equals the target fertility rate that Australia would like to have. So that 22.13 is not a high number that is in any way holding back Indigenous advancement. It is actually the preferred number, whereas fertility rate is below the policy desired level for non-Indigenous Australians. Second, Many parents are now identifying their children as Indigenous, and that's the case even when the parents themselves do not identify as Indigenous. Now, we don't have full data on this as to whether the parents are wanting to raise their children with some degree of respect, awareness, and celebration of their part Indigenous heritage, or whether it's that the parents felt for some reason, due to discrimination potentially, like they could not identify as Indigenous, but they want their children to embrace it. We don't have the reasons why parents are increasingly identifying their children as Indigenous, but the effect is very noticeable and very large. There's been a wave of new identifications of people as Indigenous, and they're overwhelmingly people 0 through 5 years old. That is, it's infants who are being identified as Indigenous, not adults who are deciding to embrace their Indigenous identity. There are a small number of those, but the massive growth in the Indigenous population is due to children. And when you have a lot of children who are identified as Indigenous, despite the fact that their parents are not identified as Indigenous, that results in a very low average age for the Indigenous population. And finally, there's the other end of the scale. Tragically, life expectancy for Indigenous Australians is 8 to 9 years lower than for the population as a whole. So there's a whole swath of non-Indigenous Australians, age 70s, 80s, 90s, even the early 100s, where that group is largely missing for Indigenous Australians, or at least is dramatically decimated for Indigenous Australians, because Indigenous Australians' life expectancy is substantially lower than for the population as a whole. Now, if there are fewer old people, then of course the median age of the population would be lower. Where there are more old people, as for majority Australia, the median age is higher. Okay, a bigger problem is lack of employment. Partly this is an artifact of age. Young people are less likely to be employed. They are either in school or they are more likely to be unemployed even after they graduate school. So that's part of the explanation as to why there's low Indigenous employment. Partly, low Indigenous employment levels are an artifact of remoteness. 15% of Indigenous Australians live in remote and very remote areas, and those are areas where it's relatively difficult to find employment. But among the remaining 85% of Indigenous Australians who live in metropolitan and regional Australia, they also have very low levels of educational attainment. This results in low earnings and low levels of employment. Statistics for Greater Sydney, for example, still show a large gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So when we think the problem might be remoteness, we can focus the analysis just on a metropolitan area. And the largest concentration of Indigenous Australians is in Greater Sydney. And so focusing in on that, we'll see that the percentage of adults who are actually working in Greater Sydney is just shy of 50%. For Indigenous adults, that is 44.6%, so 5 percentage points lower of adults in work. Now, that's despite the fact that this figure for non-Indigenous Australians includes many elderly people, whereas this figure for Indigenous Australians has relatively fewer elderly people in the group who would be retired. So you'll see that labor force participation among Indigenous Australians is not so much different. It's the percentage of people who are actually working. That is, the unemployment rate is much higher among Indigenous people than among non-Indigenous people. Second, even among people in Greater Sydney, the percent with university degrees among Indigenous people is only 1/3 of those who do not have university degrees. The result is an income gap of approximately 23%. There's still a substantial depression of income among Indigenous Australians. Partly that's due to the fact they're younger, but the greater proportion of it is due to the fact that they're much less educated. Policy to address the Indigenous income gap really then breaks down to two main elements. First, Australia has to somehow address the Indigenous education deficit. AB-study Centrelink payments are available, but they're relatively modest on the scale of $200 to $300 a week. That's not really going to encourage people into full-time study, giving up a full-time job to be in study full-time. And let's face it, people who are able to study full-time are generally the portion of the population who are able to work full-time. The cost of giving up working full-time in order to study is just very high. When universities do try to attract Indigenous Australians, they often do it through waiving ATAR minimums. That is, they simply say that, well, if you're Indigenous, you don't have to meet the minimum 80 ATAR for the degree you're applying for. We'll let you in with, a 60 ATAR or a 50 ATAR. Now, that may sound generous to the student, but in fact, it sets the student up for failure. Waiving the ATAR minimum just means putting a student into a degree in which they will struggle. What's more, through these programs, students are generally steered into low-stakes art degrees. I say low-stakes arts degrees because, let's face it, an arts degree is just a credential. An arts degree, like a degree in sociology or political science or history or English or, dare I say, Indigenous studies, these degrees only prepare you in a generic sense for participation in the adult workforce. They don't lead to a specific career pathway. The university programs that are targeted to Indigenous students generally do not feed them into business programs, engineering programs, technology programs, nursing programs, education programs, allied health programs, to say nothing of medicine and law. That is, they don't feed them into degrees where attaining the degree will dramatically improve their employability. So you have the challenge that if somebody is of low ATAR, of generally low skill, gets an arts degree, because let's face it, very few students fail out of arts degrees, vanishingly few students who show up actually fail out of an arts degree, then after 3 or 4 years, that student now has a degree, but the student is probably no more employable than the student was 3 or 4 years previously, which is to say non-Indigenous Australians who go into arts degrees are generally already employable, they just need the credential. Whereas many Indigenous Australians who are steered into arts degrees, who don't meet the minimum requirements, are not employable initially, and they're still not employable after attaining an arts degree. Second, there's the challenge of providing employment in remote and very remote Australia. This is even more difficult. So let's take just a case study example. Most job creation in Indigenous Australia, in remote and regional Australia, focuses on government funding. So I had a slide, the title slide of this presentation was a slide of Meningrida, forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, in the Northern Territory. That picture of Meningrida, which is a port, you can see it here, Meningrida, on the northern end of the Northern Territory. That area is population 2,518, so it's a small town. Now, a population of 2,518 makes it very large by the standards of Indigenous settlements in very remote Australia. In that town, the percent of people in the labor force, percent of population that's Indigenous is 91.2%. Essentially, everybody in that town is either Indigenous or providing services to the Indigenous population. There's a very tiny proportion of people in the town who are non-Indigenous and not involved in providing Indigenous services. Only about a third of the people in the town are in the labor force, of whom only about a half are working. Thus, the total percentage of people in the town who are working is under, percentage of adults who are working is under 20%. Now, that's in a best case scenario. This is a large town on the coast, a town that has tourism due to the coast, a town that has a port, and that has road access to Darwin. Now note, the road access is 11 hours by dirt road to get there. That's pretty bad. But, I mean, it could be much, much worse. I mean, we see towns that are even more remote than Meningrida. Right? So, a large town on the coast with road access, with a port, that's a best case scenario. And even here, we're only seeing 20% of adults working. Now, the program that was featured in this town this is from an ABC article, New Remote Jobs Program to Fund Hundreds of Roles in Remote Community. And this is a photo from Meningrida, the photo taken by the local Aboriginal corporation, the Bawinanga Homelands Aboriginal Corporation, which seems to be very active in improving lives of people of the Bawinanga Nation. And I apologize for the pronunciation. It's not a word that I know well. The jobs involved mainly involve community service. They're funded by the National Indigenous Australians Agency, which has funded 650 positions through this program, the Remote Jobs Economic Development Program. The ultimate goal is to fund 6,000 jobs through 2030. This is costing somewhere around, the first tranche was $700 million. That was for 3,000 jobs. The whole program will cost $1.5 billion for 6,000 jobs, roughly speaking. And that's only providing jobs for the next, an average of 3 years per job. So it says through 2030, but many of the jobs aren't up and running yet. The expected life in job is 3 years per job for 6,000 jobs. Now, those jobs only receive temporary funding. They're only for a few years. Here are some examples of the sorts of jobs. So there will be jobs for cultural officers supporting language groups. So, people to teach the local Aboriginal languages. There are jobs for a music studio to teach music and promote homegrown talent, so fantastic. And then the largest number of jobs that in this little excerpt I've provided is for people to work at the local pool. There is a public pool in the town in Meningrida, and this pool will have staff, as it should, of local Aboriginal people providing the necessary, engineering, cleaning, lifeguarding, for that pool. So all worthy causes for jobs, but they're all temporary jobs, and they're all publicly funded jobs, which means the continuation of these jobs depends on renewal of grant funding. If that renewal does not come in time, then people will be out of employment while they wait for a new program to come along and fund similar jobs. And that's exactly what happened in the past. The Remote Jobs Economic Development Program is a renewal of a previous community development program which had funded jobs previously. That program lapsed. There's now a 2 to 3 year gap where people are not employed, waiting for this next program to employ people for 3 years. And then there will, unless things run differently, there will be a gap of 1, 2, or 3 years until the next program comes through. That is, these are not permanent civil service positions that are funded as government jobs, as they would be for civil servants working in Canberra or in the New South Wales government. These are temporary community jobs. Now, the ultimate effect of all this is to keep communities on life support. It's to support the continued existence of remote communities through occasional and intermittent employment instead of long-lasting economic development. Eliminating the Indigenous income deficit, thus, is very difficult. In urban areas, it requires raising Indigenous incomes through the provision of serious incentives for individual Indigenous people to upskill. That is to say, real education isn't just lowering standards and pushing people through a degree. Real education requires a serious commitment to study. If students are coming in without the necessary prerequisites, they have to do hard work to learn those prerequisites. So, for example, if we wanted to get Indigenous Australians into engineering, they would many of them who had come from a less well-structured family and educational background would need perhaps 2 years of foundational study. Now, how are they going to earn a living during those 2 years of foundational study? Where are they going to live during those 2 years of foundational study? But if you don't give them the foundational study, where are they supposed to learn calculus so they can then go on into electrical engineering? Well, they can't, which is why we put them into a degree in Indigenous Studies in a Bachelor of Arts, because that does not require any background beyond the student's own identity. Or we put them into a sociology degree, which requires virtually no prior background in the social sciences. The current system likely shows few rewards for those who enter it. That is to say, there's little incentive to pursue an arts degree if you're an Indigenous Australian who's poorly prepared, because first, you could earn more money just working instead of going to school, and second, you're unlikely to have an increased income based on your school achievements. Or I shouldn't say that you personally will not have an increased income, but statistically, you won't gain the same expected increased income as somebody who is well prepared who goes into the same degree program. How could we solve this? We could offer residential bursaries, so we could put people up in college-style housing, just like the University of Sydney has residential colleges. Well, there could be residential colleges for Aboriginal Australians. Only those could be provided free or largely free for Indigenous Australians who live there. Those colleges could provide foundations programs to help students through the degree. We would have to reward students for undertaking that additional work, which is to say this would all be very expensive because it requires not just getting people into a degree, it requires bringing people's skills up to the same level as that prevails in the population as a whole. Second, in remote areas, raising Indigenous incomes, I'm sorry to say, generally requires relocation off-country. If we look at Meningrida, the median personal income is $256. If we look at Greater Darwin, the median personal income for Indigenous Australians in Greater Darwin is $700. Right, so we could almost triple personal incomes just by people moving from Meningrida to Darwin. Now, obviously, there should be no kind of program of forced displacement. That would be a complete anathema. But we might consider programs that would facilitate the move, and a program that would facilitate that move might also be combined with programs that facilitate greater education. This, however, raises challenging questions about coloniality, modernization, and even, some would say, genocide that Australian policymakers prefer not to answer. So, for example, if the local Aboriginal language spoken in Meningrida is only maintained by the fact that there is a critical mass of local speakers, well, putting that group into the Greater Darwin milieu would likely result in the loss of that language. The same way that communities who came to Australia from Europe after World War II have now largely lost their ancestral languages and adopted English. They've lost their ancestral identities and adopted English. Now, it was a voluntary move for people who made that decision to come to Australia from other countries over the last 70 years. Certainly, any move for Indigenous Australians would have to be voluntary. But the question is, should the government be complicit in a potential genocide by enabling individual Indigenous people to be able to pursue their own prosperity? After all, it would be a rare student from Meningrida who comes to Sydney, gets an engineering or a medical or a law degree, and then goes back to practice in Meningrida. Almost certainly that student would settle in Sydney, marry in Sydney, and be lost to the Indigenous community. So we have this tension between helping Indigenous individuals and maintaining Indigenous identity. That is not easy to solve. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And as always, I love to hear from people who have comments. So please be in touch. I'm easy to find, and I will respond to all comments in the comments section. Thank you.